Hey, CJ 3450, Injustice in America. Hope you're doing well. So we're moving into corrections, which is the last part of chapter 6. And again, there'll be some supplemental readings as well embedded into the PowerPoint slideshow. But basically, corrections, the root word is correct because originally prisons in particular were aimed at correcting people. So you take a criminal who's committing a lot of crime. The idea is you send them to a penitentiary, prison, so they can make penitence, pray for forgiveness, ask for forgiveness, become whole again, save their soul. They get out, they abide by the law. So corrections was originally interested in correcting people or rehabilitation. As you probably can guess, based on living in America today and what you've learned in the class, corrections has largely become, in particular prisons, have largely become places of incapacitation. We're just holding people there. We're warehousing them on a temporary basis because 90% or 95%, depending upon the jurisdiction, will get out one day. So we're just holding them until they complete their sentence. Corrections is the end result of the criminal justice network. So check out your PowerPoint presentation for more details. It includes all the forms of punishment that I introduced in the last video, but institutional corrections, which is serving in institutions like prisons and jails, that also includes the death penalty, by the way, which the next video will be about. And it includes community corrections, which are corrections served in the community, probation, parole, and intermediate sanctions. So intermediate sanctions are those things between incapacitation, incarceration, and probation. Look at the numbers again in your PowerPoint slideshow from the end of 2016. Almost 7 million people incarcerated. Please know these numbers, by the way. You don't have to memorize them. You just have to kind of be able to match them between prison, jail, that sort of thing, probation, and parole. So 4.5 million are under community supervision. Most of those are on probation. 2.2 million are in institutional corrections like prison and jail. Most of those are in state prison. Okay, and you'll see the numbers in PowerPoint. The United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. That's pretty incredible because it's ironic if you consider that Americans believe in freedom, liberty, and yet we deny more people per 100,000 or more people per 100, a higher percentage than any other country in the world. That's literally the definition of irony. The rate is one thing, but the fact that we have the most people in prison is another. We are not the largest country, not even close in terms of population size, but we have way more people incarcerated than any other nation. So there's several slides that show this reality, including if you took all of the American inmates and put them in one place, it would be the fourth biggest city in the United States behind New York, LA, and Chicago. You'll see some rates in your PowerPoint slideshow showing how high we are. And I tell this joke, but you remember the sprinter Usain Bolt, who the world record holder in the 100 meters, his last attempt to break the world record, his last race, he was winning so easily, he kind of eased up. And as he crossed the finish line, he looked back and smiled at his competitors. That's what we are in terms of imprisonment. No one comes close to us, which is very ironic. Now you'll look at the state and federal prison populations from 1925 to 2016. If you open the PowerPoint slideshow, you'll see that from 1925 until the early 70s, incarceration was relatively stable. So it didn't matter what was happening in the country with crime rates or civil rights movements or anti-war protests or women's movements or whatever. This really didn't make incarceration increase. But then starting in 1973, we see this huge increase basically through the Obama administration, this massive increase in incarceration. So the question is, why does that happen? And it was not because we had more crime, although crime did increase in the 1960s, the late 1960s in particular, with homicide rates. It wasn't the result of an increase in crime rate. So the simple answer is why we had a huge increase in incarceration was simply we decided to get tough on crime. So this was a political decision, a policy decision by both state and federal legislators. It wasn't just Congress, it was also states, governors, and legislatures. So the general get tough on crime, the conservative political philosophy that was followed with crime control, again, that's not Republican, Democrat, that's both parties embracing this. So we embraced more of the crime control model than the due process model. So that's the main reason, number one. The second reason related to that is the war on drugs. So you'll see a quote taken from the Senate. The source of these quotes in your PowerPoint slideshow is the Sentencing Project, which I highly recommend you check out, sentencingproject.org, I believe. But just Google it or what have you, and you'll see that the war on drugs played a huge role in why we incarcerated more people. You'll see from 1980 to 2015, the number of people incarcerated in prisons and jails for drug offenses skyrocketed. And you'll see that about, I'm looking at my PowerPoint slideshow here, sometime in the late 1990s, the number of people incarcerated for drug offenses actually surpassed or became higher than the number of people incarcerated for property offenses like theft, burglary, etc. So we obviously had a war on drugs that played a role in our incarceration increasing. You'll see some numbers in your PowerPoint slideshow from different studies. Some of the studies are from 1980 to 1993, the others from 1985 to 1996, and the last one is from 1990 to 2000. So these are different studies, but they're all showing somewhere between a 200 and 545% increase in incarceration depending upon the years and the level of government. But the bottom line is from 1990 to 2000, 20% of the total increase in incarceration was just due to drug offenses. So now you look at some of the most recent data, 15% of state prisoners are drug offenders, 47% of federal prisoners are drug offenders, almost half. Now that actually got up to about 60%, so that's come down a little bit. 25% of people on probation are drug offenders, and about a third, 33% of people on parole are drug offenders. Now, if you believe that this is a waste of resources, or if you believe that it's ineffective because it doesn't reduce drug use or drug abuse, or if you believe that there's racial biases in the drug war, all of which are documented by data, doesn't mean you have to believe it. But if you believe those things, maybe you'll see these numbers and say, I have a better use of those resources. So maybe you want to have a war on an enemy, or you want to build roads, or you want to increase the salary of teachers or police officers, what have you. Maybe you want to send a big rebate or a stimulus check to people who can't work right now, since about 35% of Americans have 45% of Americans, I think, have either lost their job or wages because of the coronavirus. Google that to find the research that I'm talking about. But my point is we could use this money for something else if you wanted to, but we're using it on incarcerating drug offenders. Now, the third reason related to the first two is we have more people going to prison. And fourth, they're serving longer sentences. So things like the 3 strikes law, which mandates a minimum sentence of 25 years to life in California, for example, or the truth in sentencing laws in some states that require you to serve 85% of your sentences. These things also lead to more incarceration for longer periods of time. The fifth reason is the abolition of parole. So you'll see a quote there from the Sentencing Project showing what happened when the federal government and states actually abolished discretionary parole, where people could just get out for good behavior and that sort of thing. You'll see the number of people serving life sentences increase dramatically. This is not just for murder, but for other crimes as well. And then I'm including an interesting slide from 1973 when incarceration started. The incarceration boom started to the early 2000s. And what you see is there's some key events that happened there in terms of laws that were passed with the death penalty and preventive detention, certain crime bills, the drug war, and things like that. But what you'll notice is in 1980, we elected a Republican President Ronald Reagan and a Democratic Senate and Democratic House. In 1988, we elected a Republican president George H.W. Bush, who also had a Democratic Senate and House. And then in 1992, we elected a Democratic governor for president, Bill Clinton, and he ended up having a Republican Congress. And so it didn't matter who was in power, whether it be Democrats in the presidency or Republicans, or Democrats in the Congress or Republicans. It didn't matter. This incarceration trend continued. So that shows that both of these parties embraced the political ideology of conservatism when it came to crime control. Tough on crime, more prison, more police, right? Now, the good news is we did see a decrease in crime, as you would expect. If you look at the data that I provide In the PowerPoint slideshow, you'll see there were declines in crime, but they weren't consistent. It didn't vary across states significantly as you'd expect. There's a quote from the Sentencing Project explaining all of this. It was a very ineffective use of resources. And criminologists say about only 25% of declines in crime, violent crime in particular, came from incarceration, which means 75% came from something else. Some of that was due, in fact, the majority of that was due to non-criminal justice factors, things outside of incarceration. And you'll see some examples. The economy got better, the population got older, and if you recall, older people don't commit street crime generally, right? It's younger people. The crack cocaine markets were stabilized, as we talked about in class. And then the most controversial one is legalized abortion in 1973. I won't get into that here. If you're interested, I'll happy to talk about it later or send you a message or what have you. But this is from research from an App State grad who wrote the book Freakonomics, co-author of that book. And if you're interested, you can look at that argument or just Google whether abortion played a role. You would expect that if a large number of fetuses were aborted in 1973, 1974, 1975, 1976, et cetera, about 15 to 25 years later, you would see a reduction in crime, because that's when those babies would have hit, if they were born, those babies would have hit the crime peak, 15 to 25 years old. And that's exactly when we started to see a decline in crime, including murder, right in that period, 15 to 25 years. So that's where the theory comes from. Now, these crime declines should be seen as temporary, because again, most of the inmates will be released, the vast majority will be released. So that means we need to be concerned about what happens to them inside. Now, if you're a tough on crime person, you probably don't care what happens to them inside, which I understand. I don't blame you. I'm not saying you're wrong. Get some coffee. But if you're a human rights advocate and you believe that they're still human beings, you might be more concerned about what happens in prison. But either way, you should be concerned as a citizen, because you're paying for their incarceration and they're going to be there. This is going to be happening to them. And when they get out, they're going to be moving back into our community. Okay. So the so-called pains of imprisonment are losses that inmates face upon incarceration. I actually wrote a poem about this, strangely enough. If you're interested, I can post that or send it to you. But this comes from research from people who've been inside prison, and it's been verified for now decades. So here's what people lose in prison. Number one, and most important, is their liberty, their freedom. We don't send people to prison for punishment. We send them there as punishment. Their punishment is losing their freedom. So think about all the things you like to do in your free time. You can't do those things in prison. You certainly can't do them legally without getting in trouble. So having a beer after a hard day, having sex with someone you love, or especially if it's a heterosexual relationship, not going to happen. Playing pool, going for a jog, going for a hike, going for a swim, going to the gym. Well, there's gyms, but my point, go out with your boys, go out with your girls, ladies' night, whatever you do, go to a concert. None of that's happening. You also lose your autonomy, which means the ability to govern yourself. All decisions are made for you. You don't have any security there. Violence is used as a control mechanism. Assault, murder, rape, etc. You're denied heterosexual relationships, as I mentioned. Even if you are gay, your relationships are likely not to be consensual in prison because they're not allowed. They have to be in secret. You lose all your goods and services, all of the things you value, your shoes, your clothes, your jewelry, whatever. You can't vote, so you lose your citizenship. You're treated as a number, so you have no dignity. And then you have a stigma of a felon that follows you for the rest of your life. These are the losses or the pains of imprisonment that happen. So we know what happens to people who go to prison. They're damaged, they're angry, they become dependent on society to make decisions. So imagine if you went to prison for 20 years and you got out and all of a sudden you have to earn money, balance a checkbook, pay bills, take care of a family, catch up with technology. It would be nearly impossible, as I'm sure you can imagine. We also disrupt families, as you can imagine, and some neighborhoods have a lack of male role models, which we talked about in class. And the higher the ratio of females to males, the more likely you are to have crime in that community. So we're actually creating crime through incarceration, according to research by Todd Clear and others. So we have more crime in their neighborhoods. We create an incentive for people to commit crime as well. Now, the good news is that half of the people in prison are violent offenders. The bad news, if you will, is 20% are drug offenders, 20% are property offenders, and 10% are public order offenders. These are immigration offenders and weapons offenders and that sort of thing. There'll be widespread disagreement among you about which of these people really needs to be incarcerated. Some of you will say all, some of you will say some. But the point is, not all of these people are actually a high threat to us, and yet we're spending $34,000 a year on average per year to hold these people in prison. Only 1% of people in prison are white collar or corporate offenders, elite offenders. That's innocent bias, right? The law does not define their crimes as serious. The media does not focus on it. We're not concerned about it. We don't take action against them. Even though they do more damage to us, they're not the ones getting incarcerated. That's innocent bias. Your typical inmate is young, is poor, is minority, and is male. They're uneducated and underemployed. That means that the year prior to their incarceration, they were either unemployed, part-time employed, or full-time employed making very little money. That's what underemployed means. I'm giving you some data. These data are somewhat dated, but it doesn't matter because these things don't change. You see a large percentage are male, black, Hispanic, haven't completed high school, earning less than $2,000 a month, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, unemployed or underemployed. So this is your typical inmate, okay? 10th grade education. What do we expect from them when they get out? We really expect them to be corrected in the absence of severe, intense vocational training, educational programs, things that they can help them with their opportunities when they get out. We shouldn't expect them to be healed or better. Now we know that African Americans are disproportionately incarcerated. That's the next slide in your PowerPoint presentation. It's also touched upon in your book. And I've given you the data, and you'll see a series of books that have been written about this. We know, okay, society knows this is real. 6% of the U.S. population, roughly, is black men, African American men. They make up almost 35 or 40% of the people we incarcerate. That's incredible in the land of the free. This is something that all those books are about. Okay. By the way, I made a music video about it. If you're interested, it's with one of Bob Marley's sons and some pretty well-known rappers. So if you're interested, I will happily share that with you. But it's about how much it costs to send someone to prison, what the racial biases are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're interested, I'll post that as well. You'll see the minimum cost of imprisonment is about $50 billion a year. I've included some additional readings, one from the Atlantic and one from the New York Times, showing you how much it costs in other places. It's often way more expensive than $31,000. I mentioned $34,000 earlier. That's a more recent number. But we're spending a minimum of $50 billion a year and a lot more. The cost is higher in some places than others, as you might imagine. Now, the last cost that I'll get into is this bias, or disparity, I should say, more accurately. African American men have a 32% chance of going to prison. White men, only 6%. Hispanics or Latinos, 17%. If you look at who's in prison, now this is from 2005, but some of the data are harder to come by. 1 in 8 black men who are in their 20s was in prison, but only 1 in 59 males, white males, sorry, and 1 in 26 Hispanic males. These data are in your PowerPoint slideshow. And young black men, this is black men, African American men, ages 20 to 39, I think you agree are young, make up a third of all the people we incarcerate. So remember Michelle Alexander's argument that the criminal justice system is a racial caste system meant to keep black people in their place? This is consistent with that argument. It doesn't prove it, but it's consistent with what she says. You'll see the actual imprisonment rate by race in a PowerPoint graph in your, including the source if you want to check it, in your PowerPoint slideshow. And you'll see some really cool figures from the Sentencing Project showing you the likelihood of going to prison in your life based on not only race and ethnicity, but also sex or gender. You see, obviously, men have a higher rate than women. That's because we commit more crime. But black men stand out even black women have a higher rate than white women, consistent with that argument about racial caste. Now, here's the bottom line. We have a correlation between punitiveness, war on crime, conservative ideology, tough on crime, the war on drugs, and racial disparities. That doesn't mean it's a causal effect, but these things go together. The question is why. Why is it that the tougher we get on crime, the worse it gets for people of color and poor people? Why is it? That's a big question. The class suggests this is not necessarily intended. It comes about from the fact that lawmakers are worms, wealthy, whiter, older, rich men, and the media are owned by the same people. So even if you deny the existence of racism or discrimination in the United States, which some of you might do, it doesn't require discrimination on intentional discrimination or racism. It's innocent in the sense that it comes from the law and the media. That means it doesn't require bias in criminal justice, police officials, prosecutors, and that sort of thing. Now, if you add individual bias by actual officers and prosecutors, that makes it worse, right? And that contextual bias we've talked about, contextual discrimination we see in some places at some time, that's going to make it worse. But it doesn't require it. So this means that in order to reform things, we have to change the law and change the media. That'll be our last unit later in the class, which will be next week, I guess. All right, I hope you guys are well. Please, if you have any questions, let me know. And keep well. This is hard on all of us. I really miss interacting with you, your faces, hearing your questions and that sort of thing. But we're doing the best we can, and hopefully we'll be back to normal soon. All right. Talk to you guys soon. I'll be filming a video about the death penalty and drug war next. And then next week we'll be talking about the future and concluding